Welcome to Burning Platforms, our fortnightly look at the intersection between tech and politics, brought to you by Capita's Centre of the Public Square. I'm Peter Lewis. This week we take a deep dive into the changing role of mainstream media with author Tim Dunlop. But first, our rundown of the latest news from around the world with our regular panel, Digital Rights Watch Chair Lizzie O'Shea and Health Engine CEO Dan Stinton. Well, welcome to this fortnight's edition of Burning Platforms. Welcome to our regular panellists. Dan Stinton, who's all the way over in Sydney this week. G'day, Dan.
G'day, Peter. G'day, Lizzie.
And Lizzie O'Shea from her very schmick-looking room in Melbourne. Hello, Lizzie. How you doing?
Good, thanks, Pete. Hi, Dan. Good to be here.
And then we have our special guest this week, who I'm not allowed to call a blogger, although he was one of Australia's first serious media bloggers back in the day when that was a thing. Now an author of a series of really successful books about the future and the way that the internet's shaping our world. Tim Dunlop, thanks for joining us, mate. It's great to have you here, and we'll be digging into some of your ideas in the second part of the episode. But how could we not kick off this week's discussion with Elon Musk versus the Australian E-Safety Commissioner? We have a real war of words going on, which is such a bread and butter for X, and so much better than a real war as well. So it's one that we can all lean into. The PM leaned into it today, calling Elon Musk an arrogant billionaire who thinks he's above the law. Musk has been on his platform that used to be called Twitter, but is now called X, calling the E-Safety Commissar a censorship commissar. And the good E-Safety Commissioner herself, Julia Grant, has been out there in the old media saying we expect platforms that benefit from Australia's using their service to make genuine efforts to protect our citizens from harmful content. So what's going on? Well, the catalyst was the propagation of a video of the stabbing of the bishop in the Assyrian church last week, just days after the Bondi attack. And it was one of those black swan events that the E-Safety Commissioner was actually set up to deal with, established in 2015. And maybe we can talk in a few minutes about the model. It was set up by Turnbull back in 2015 to really deal with black swan events like bullying, like child porn, and other things that were so bad that something had to be done. And this, at this moment, was so bad that something had to be done. Musk has turned it into a Twitter war or a culture war, and the media is lapping it up, and the politicians are leaning into it, into this flurry of outrage, this fault line between order and freedom. But the real side of it is that there are real laws in place, and X is now in federal court where it faced fines of $785,000 per day, which, given it probably doesn't affect Elon Musk, but it probably affects the profitability of X a little bit. So we can take this in a few directions. I just think the most interesting part of this is the way that the discourse around freedom of speech, which is very much the American absolutist, is bumping into Australia's regulatory regime at the moment. So, Lizzie, you followed the rise and rise of the E-Safety Commissioner with a critical eye. What are you making of all this?
Yeah, I should start by saying the Online Safety Act, which was introduced under Scott Morrison, so the Conservative government, was very expansive in the powers that it afforded the E-Safety Commissioner, and that was a source of criticism. In our view, it was not appropriate to grant such broad powers, and also the powers are based on pretty outdated classification code. So, that sets up a regime for the kinds of content that is refused classification, so not able to be broadcast in any means. And then there's different levels of classification. So it's commonly used in broadcast media like television. That's where maybe people have encountered it. This is the regime that exists in relation to online safety as well. And yeah, it means that she does have extremely broad powers, and in our view, that required some tempering, some balancing of rights as well. And that was some of the submissions that we made in the course of that bill's passage through Parliament. This is obviously not a scenario where I am particularly interested in defending posting this content. I mean, it's horrible, violent content. And even though there's I guess, something of a question as to what kind of harm is caused, but I do appreciate that being on a platform where you go every day to kind of catch up on news or hear from public figures or, the PM, the foreign minister, they're all on Twitter. Having to then encounter horrendous violent content, I think is a nasty scenario. It's not nothing. It certainly contributes to a hostile environment for people who want to participate in public life. And it is, I do think it's an interesting face-off because these are extremely broad-ranging powers. Elon Musk is, kind of like a petulant teenager, but he is prepared to at least challenge that broad scope and see whether he gets anywhere, not just around the nature of the content itself, but also the jurisdictional reach of the E-Safety Commissioner, whether she can go beyond Australian borders. And that, I think, is an interesting question.
Can you just unpack that a little bit? Because that was the other bit. Well, that he also got on Twitter. Or do you still tweet on X or do you X on X? Whatever he did, he was on his own platform basically saying any country is allowed to censor content for all countries, which is what the Australian E-Safety Commissioner is demanding. Then what is to stop any country from controlling the entire internet? So what is that, it feels like overreach, but what is the extraterritorial part of this power?
I guess the question is raised is around whether Australians can access this content via a VPN, for example. It's not enough that it's not stored anymore or in an Australian server. That does mean that there's a potential for her powers to reach beyond the physical borders of Australia to say that the content shouldn't reside on US servers either, because it creates a scenario where Australians can still access it via technical means. I think that's an interesting question, and I think it's not unreasonable to point out that that's a very broad power if in fact that's how far it reaches. There's a practical component to this as well, as there is with this whole issue. Like, what happens if this platform just refuses to comply and starts racking up fines? I think, to be fair to the Commissioner, notwithstanding my criticisms of her powers, she's been on this for a long time. Like, she's raised concerns about X. When they got rid of their trust and safety team, she said, I want to know what you're doing about this. She should, there's also a risk of fines if they didn't answer that appropriately. This is not the first time that she's raised concerns, and this is a company that appears to show contempt for law or a disinterest in compliance. Other platforms have shown at least a commitment to some kind of social license to operate. And it does make me think that's a good thing, that they feel under this obligation to develop a social license, because the alternative is this, which is kind of a lawlessness that I think is very troubling. Query about this particular instance, but broader application I think is very troubling, to have companies that just don't comply and for which there's no consequence meaningfully.
Dan, the other theory, of course, is it's not that he won't comply, but he can't comply because he's got rid of so many of the people that were working in the trust and safety unit. I think there was a US Congress hearing this week where actually the E-Safety Commissioner was quoted as saying they're down to under 100 people that are actually working on content moderation across the entire platform. Is this, how are you reading it?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's hard to keep to understand the strengths of the case, because as Lizzie articulated before, this is untested, and it does feel like it would be a tremendous amount of power for the E-Safety Commissioner to exert if they were in fact able to effectively censor Twitter globally. But to your point, Pete, I guess I've been following this story, obviously, from the view, and perhaps not obviously, but from the view of what a publisher would do in this circumstance, given my background in news publishing. And we just wouldn't, no responsible publisher in Australia would publish this video in its entirety. I mean, to give you one example of many, at the ABC 7:30, when covering this story, broadcast snippets of the video, edited so that you didn't see the full horrific nature of it, because that was the responsible thing to do. And what I find interesting about this is that, once again, we're back to talking about platforms which have all of the power and influence of the legacy media, but do not take their responsibility seriously, which, to your point, Pete, is evidenced by the fact that Elon has reduced his trust and safety team down to a handful of people when clearly that's nowhere near sufficient. So, I mean, it's hard. I guess my take on this, I'm just surprised that this is the hill. In fact, I'm not surprised. I'm disappointed that this is the hill that Elon is choosing to die on this issue. Like, if you want to prove a point around the ability of your platform to have or to disseminate free speech or whatever, do you really want to go to war over a video as horrific as this? I mean, is this really worth the fight? And I think I land when it's not. I mean, you're effectively arguing for a snuff video. It just feels like a complete lack of acknowledgement of the responsibility that they have for the large audience that they have. So I guess this is just another example of what Elon has done since he's taken over Twitter, reducing the size of the trust and safety team down to next to nothing, and then further demonstration he doesn't take his responsibilities seriously. What do we do about it? I don't know.
So Jackie Lambie has sort of said that the politicians should get off Twitter in protest. And while I think, there is probably still a role for it to play, but I do wonder whether it is going to go in the way of other apps that have kind of permitted this kind of content to remain, which is they're uncommercial, because who wants to be posting any advertising on a website like this? And also, who wants to go on it? And maybe also there is a role for, politicians and journalists and people who've traditionally relied on it to take a lead and say, we're not going to go on it anymore. Like, I do wonder about that. Like, it does seem so contemptuous of regulatory regimes that you sort of question whether they see themselves as above all sorts of laws, and do you really want to be associated with that? And do you want to send a message that it's okay? And I do wonder whether that's the other thing because the other component is commercial interests are the other content moderation tool that goes on in the background. Like, there's the need to curry favor with advertisers and stuff to maintain the life of your platform. And I do wonder whether that's what's going to be the thing that ends up biting him, because
it's bad business, isn't it? I mean, it's ultimately bad business. Twitter has become far less relevant.
What do you mean? It's a bad business. Like, he's cut the business to shreds. I do think it's interesting, and I'll bring Tim in here, that politicians, one of the ways that they got round traditional media to go straight to audience was using social media, and a lot of the politicians that are hyperventilating about Musk are doing it still on their platform. So good on Lambie for following me off Twitter, but the more the better, I reckon. What's your take, though, Tim?
I'm just wondering if you guys are aware that Senator Babbitt currently has the video displaying on Twitter through his account. So it's not just Musk challenging the regulator in this case. It's actually an Australian senator. Of all things.
I've never heard of Senator Babbitt before, but he's our UAP representative in your good state of Victoria.
Consider yourself blessed, Peter.
Ralph Emmanuel Didier Deej Babbitt. And he only commenced his 6-year term a year ago. Yeah.
That's right. The $1 billion senator after all the money that, what's his name? Clive Palmer spent on getting him elected. Yeah. So, I'd be interested to hear Lizzie's take on what position he's put himself in by making this available. Like, and I mean, he's very much doing it in the way of take it down if you dare and charge me if you dare.
I reckon he's specials to get his own Sky News show before we know it.
Well. But I mean, this is what the whole thing ties in with. It is this bigger issue, I think, around this hybrid space that we have now. That's the media environment, and it's one of the things that sort of makes the regulation difficult. I think is that we're treating. They are discrete things, and content lands differently on a television station as opposed to somebody's social media feed. And to that extent, they can be treated differently, I think. But it seems to me we need to think more about what the actual media environment is these days. What are we actually regulating? And then having said that, the other thing that kind of annoys me about all of this is that a lot of the outrage that's happening at the moment is clearly driven by the commercial interests of the legacy media, who for a long time, for the longest time, and for obvious reasons, see the social media platforms as their major competition, in fact, as the destroyer of their business model, really. And, they take every opportunity to capitalise on any missteps by the social media companies to state their case, and which is fine. But what bugs me about it is that there's never an acknowledgement of any role that they might have in these sorts of issues in general. So around misinformation, less around this sort of stuff. I think the regulations that are in place and just the social habits that those mainstream media organisations have, makes it easier for them to deal with this sort of stuff in a way. But they're nonetheless within that misinformation, disinformation creating environment to some extent themselves. And I don't like the way that they completely refuse to kind of police themselves in that regard. I think a good example of this was last Sunday's episode of Insiders, where this was the main topic of conversation. And there was some legitimate criticism of what the social media platforms are going, but there was absolutely no consideration given to the role that they've played, which was particularly egregious, I thought, in light of the fact that one of the things they talked about was the misidentifying of the perpetrator in the Westfield stabbing thing, which, was that misinformation was spread quite substantially by Channel 7. I would have thought that it would have warranted a mention in
error, though. In error, though, Tim. In error. I think that there's a world of difference between the two, but I suspect we're going to get into this later in the show.
I think we will. I feel like we need to move on with our discussions of our little grabs on the news, but we are going to go back to this in the second half, and then we'll let you two guys go at it, and it'll be fun to watch. At least listen to. Lizzie, you wanted to bring to the table the story out of the States, Google firing 28 staff after a protest against the firm's contract with the Israeli government. A group of employees taking action with posters reading "No Cloud Apartheid, Googlers against genocide." What was it all about, and what does it tell us about the broader environment inside Google at the moment?
Yeah, well, this is not the first time that Google employees have taken action in protest at what their company was doing. The company has famously got a motto, or used to have a motto, around doing no evil, but that's been deteriorating of late. And so this particular protest is about a project called Project Nimbus, which reportedly, according to Time, involves Google establishing a secure instance of Google Cloud on Israeli soil, which then allows the Israeli government to perform large-scale data analysis, AI training, database hosting, and other kinds of use of powerful computing technology offered by Google. So the details are pretty scant about it, and it's interesting reading the accounts because not even all the Google employees know exactly the contours of the project. But what it sounds like is, the use of Google's high-tech capacity to carry out warfare, really. And this is, I think, a particularly interesting revelation in a context in which we discussed last episode the use of AI in generating targets in this particular conflict, in the bombardment of Gaza by Israel, by the Israeli Defense Force. And so there's this real a nexus that's kind of quite easy to infer between Google's capacity and then the use of this in the battlefield. So 28 employees have been fired, and it's based around, a sit-in kind of activity that they did, and there's all these kinds of reports of them intimidating staff, which are then denied. But I think it is interesting that even 10 years ago, I'm not sure tech workers would consider themselves workers. They thought they were kind of highly trained, highly knowledgeable staff that could move as they like between companies and earn high incomes. And it's become increasingly clear as a result of the downturn in the tech industry, as well as the kind of ethical issues that have come to the fore, like this one, that they are employees in a workplace and they're increasingly understanding that and using or seeking to use that power in the way that traditional unionised forces do, which I think is a really interesting development. So I'm quite impressed by that. And I think there's lots of ways in which it could end up being a more ongoing movement. So, the manifesto is kind of authored by this group called No Tech for Apartheid, which has had a life before this particular episode. But growing kind of cohort of people who are engaged on these topics and will take that with them wherever they end up in these big Silicon Valley companies.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's almost a dispute about a line of sight in how your work is being deployed. And in the old ways, it's almost like the idea of a secondary boycott, but with intellectual property rather than physical goods. I haven't heard anything of it before.
Well, DeepMind as well, which was acquired by Google, I think just over 10 years ago, had originally had a commitment to not using it for military purposes. OpenAI originally had this in their creation documents as well. They wouldn't be using this tech for military purposes. These things have since fallen away. DeepMind now comes under the broader policies of Google, which does permit this kind of use of the tech, and obviously OpenAI just dropped it from their platform because I imagine it's extremely lucrative. This project is worth, I think, $1.3 billion. You can imagine that military uses of sophisticated tech is only going to be a growing industry in years to come. So, in some ways, these workers are sitting at the real forefront of mapping this problem and also then formulating ways to resist it.
Dan?
Yeah, so this is fascinating for a couple of reasons for me. So I think we've spoken before about the role and responsibilities that tech companies have as they move up the stack from the infrastructure layer up to being closer to where users interact with it. We talk about this in the context of social media. So, if you're an ISP, internet service provider, I think most people would agree that there's not a role for an ISP to play in surveilling all of its customers that use it and therefore censoring content or moderating content that appears on it, because it is akin in a way to a phone company. But then you get close to the top of the stack and you have the social media platforms, and people will disagree on what their responsibilities are, potentially even on this very podcast. But nonetheless, there's I think most people would agree that there's greater responsibilities that come with that. What's interesting about this case is that we're dealing with something now which is completely new, and that is platforms which are now deploying AI technology on the infrastructure layer and being deployed in ways which the platforms themselves might not realise, but which their technology is facilitating. So now in this circumstance, I don't know how much Google knew about what Israel or any other customer was using their technology for military purposes or not. But we're entering into this kind of brave new world where it's no longer going to be good enough, I think, for these technology companies to be able to say, well, we're just the infrastructure, we're just providing infrastructure, when their technology is potentially being used for literally life and death circumstances as it appears to be in this circumstance. So whether you agree with the protesters' position or not, I just think we're entering into a completely new space, which is, it's going to be very, very hard, I think, for these tech platforms to know where their responsibilities lie. It's clearer, or it's already unclear, I guess, in the social media world. This is now that the technology is almost feeling like it's getting completely outside of the control. It's becoming a Frankenstein thing outside of the control of the actual technology platforms themselves. And I think that it's just going to be interesting to see where this goes.
But fascinatingly, it is only those working inside the company that have probably got any line of sight. So when you say a company doesn't know, the workers who are involved in deployment may have a better idea than the people that are sort of signing the deals. Tim, you got a take on this one?
A little bit. I'm interested from the Labor point of view that Lizzie, sorry, pointed out. But also, because it puts enormous this sort of development, this sort of black box development that Dan's talking about, puts enormous pressure on workers in those environments to kind of police what is happening with the technology, what is happening with their labour, if you like. And as Dan said, in a way, they're better positioned than any government is to know how these technologies are being deployed in this sort of situation. And it seems to me it's an incredibly unfair burden to put on workers to expect them to perform these protests and put their jobs at risk in the way that these guys at Google obviously have. I think that's a really interesting development and something that needs to be looked at as more and more of these circumstances arise.
We'll move on to our last little thing to bring to the table. Dan, you've been out shopping for your latest tech bro accessory, which is Limitless, a new AI tool for your meetings, an all-hearing wearable gadget. How's it been going?
Yes, I mean, to clarify, I haven't bought one of these pins and don't plan on buying one because I find it's been tremendously disturbing. But yeah, there's been a couple of really interesting products which have dropped in the last couple of weeks. The first one, which I think a lot of people will be aware of because it's got a huge amount of press and negative reviews, it must be said, which is the Humane AI pin. So for those that don't know, this is effectively I guess it's sort of a brooch size that you pin to your T-shirt, and it can do. I guess its aspiration, which is I think an interesting space to explore, is it's potentially a replacement for your smartphone. So you wear it permanently, and you can simply ask it to give you directions to something, or you can hold up some food in front of it and ask whether it's healthy or not, or what its nutritional content is or not. You can use it to. If you're in a foreign country, to translate what you're saying to someone else. There's a whole bunch of really interesting potential applications. And its core premise, if you like, is that because it's utilising AI technology, it doesn't need to be limited by the touch screen of a smartphone. That's the theory, at least. Like in practice, it's got terrible reviews.
Is that a theory or a marketing pitch?
I think that's where they're trying to go, right? They're trying to create the next sort of computing platform and how that works. So far, I mean, if you've seen the reviews, it's been universally slammed as being pretty poor performing. So I don't think that's worked. What's got less attention though, and what I have been fascinated by, is this other pendant which has been released at about the same time called Limitless. And this is a much more limited, pardon the pun, use case, which is it effectively is something that you pin to your T-shirt or whatever, and it is permanently listening to everything that you say and potentially permanently listening to everything that everyone around you says too, although it says only if those around you give consent. So there's a few things that come
by
off
clicking the box
right?
of walking within 3 meters of you or something.
Well, exactly. I mean, how do you give consent? And just on this point, so let's say that you're speaking to someone, they give consent to be recorded. Does that mean that they also give you consent to be recorded later when you take them home for a one-night stand? I mean, there's all kinds of places where this can go wrong, I think. But the purpose of it, apparently, is that you can then...
Maybe it has incognito mode.
Maybe it does. But it's effectively a perfect memory. So you can go back and say, tell me that restaurant that my friend mentioned last week when we were talking about whatever, and tell me what this important news article was that I was speaking about with someone. There's a whole bunch of... I mean, you can see the utility of it, but the downside is just massive. I mean, it's effectively taking the surveillance that we see with our browsing behaviour in, with our computers and our smartphones, and applying that to the real world. Who in their right mind is going to be comfortable with this? But apparently it's selling like hotcakes. So I'm just, maybe I must be old-fashioned, but it seems to me that the kids just don't care and are happy to be permanently recorded from this. I will never buy one of these, but I can't. What concerns me is that so many people seem to.
But it almost feels, I just see here, it's a $99 cost. So they're effectively giving it away. So the data has to be the product. The data is what they're buying. Like,
you would assume so. And I guess if they're successful, I mean, you think about it. I mean, I don't think this will be, because I still think it's a fairly limited case. But if they are successful and they become one of the dominant platforms, they're effectively, just think of the data that they're going to have access to. Millions and millions of recorded conversations of people that may or may not have consented to it, with AI insights labelled on top of that in order to do all kinds of targeting or whatever else going forward. I mean, it's a utopian world a brave new world that I don't think anyone would want to live in if they stopped for just 1 second to think about it.
It would be interesting even just to do a start on the sorts of invasions of privacy that this device could go down, Lizzie. Like, is this something that is screaming out for preemptive legal action, or just a really good set of consent protocols?
Well, consent doesn't really cut it, right? Because if it's limitless in term, didn't intend to use limitless.
That there, but are you the new spokesmodel? Lizzie O'Shea is limitless.
The consent
Digital
is
Rights Watch spokesperson for limitless. Yes, I can see it now.
If the consent provided is limitless, is what I was trying to say, then of course, then the product can use that data in a way that all sorts of ways that people didn't consent to, like it's not meaningful. I mean, yeah, like I also thought of Alexa and all the home devices basically when I saw this, because there is an argument that that's already happening, and Amazon collects a huge amount of voice data and commands and stuff like that, which I think is also troubling, dare I say it. But I think it does highlight for me the lack of substance to some of these consent claims, that you really actually do need to have an approach that says certain kinds of data, if you've got an expectation that it's not going to be recorded and kept, not just that you make the communication in public, but that it's recorded and kept and used for other purposes, that maybe there's a limitation on your capacity to do that. And I think there is an argument for proactive kind of regulation, so you don't get what did happen with ChatGPT, would be hoovering up a whole lot of content on the internet to train a chatbot. I would say some of my concern also is the use of this potentially in industrial settings, in workplaces and stuff, where I think there are fewer rights than perhaps people realise, and it's conceivable to imagine it being imposed on employees for accountability purposes, or, and there may be protective uses in their workplace as well, don't get me wrong, but I do think that may be the other side at which some of this gets used and developed, because your capacity to resist that in an employment relationship is more diminished than, say, in public spaces and in private homes even. So I'd keep an eye out for that, much in the same way that Google Glass ended up being not successful as a commercial product, but then went on to be an industrial one that's used in, for example, factory manufacturing and the like. So I wonder whether that's the place where it ends up, because there's fewer rights at work.
Just on that point, by the way, the company's previous product was a product called Rewind, which did something probably more limited to the workforce, or workplace, which is it effectively recorded all of your browsing behaviour, so that you could go back and find things that you had previously found online that you might not remember that you found. So I think they do have form in this area.
That's it. If they came up with a technology that you could go back and then correct all the bad things you've done and clear your record, like, I'd be totally up for that. I think, a human sub-editor that just sort of cleared all your mess before you've done before you do it again. So maybe there is
What on earth are you talking about? That's like ridiculous.
I've always wanted to have a human sub-editor that would just go and clear up all my mess, and maybe this could become that.
Just imagine how good our podcast would be if you had Capita in real time.
Tim, are you going to rush out and buy this one?
Look, there's a big part of me that wants to, but having said that, I would actually also say that this is maybe the sort of device that should actually be banned rather than regulated. It just seems to me that you're a bit, just not buying one, not participating, not giving consent isn't going to be enough. If enough people around you have access to these and are using them, you're implicated in everything that's going on, and you're going to have no control over that. And as Dan said, the scenarios are nightmarish to think what could happen in these circumstances. I'm really genuine. I really think this is one of those technologies that should actually be banned.
The equivalent of a loaded gun. Is it on the market in Australia yet, Dan, or is it just...
Not that I've seen. I think it's only available in the US. Just on that last point as well, Tim, it is worth noting that it is illegal in most states, I think, except in Queensland, to record someone without their knowledge. So it probably would be illegal to use this in most settings in Australia, I think. I'm not sure about the case of other jurisdictions.
All right. Well, thanks for bringing that to the table. And that was an attempt at a joke on my behalf. I wasn't seriously wanting to get... Limitless to be reworking my life, just to be clear. So let's go into our deep dive for the week. So the reason we wanted Tim to come along was off the back of a great piece he wrote on his Substack, The Future of Everything. So just to introduce Tim, he's written 4 books covering issues such as changes in the media, technology and work, and the rise of the community independence. Tim is a fellow of the Australian Basic Income Lab at Sydney Uni, Macquarie and the ANU. And as I say, he runs The Future of Everything as a Substack. I'm interested going into a bit about how you've been building up your community of readers and users as we go through this conversation. But the catalyst, Tim, was really this observation you made around the live streaming of the judgment by Justice Lee of the Lehman case last week. And one of the lines that sort of grabbed me was you said, by making the case available for live streaming, Lee lent into a form of democratic practice that favours public involvement, giving people access to the primary material. Such a proof of concept is a valuable thing. And in a week where we've live streamed that, we've also been talking about the live streaming of the crimes, the knife attack, and I guess we can also talk about the constant trauma of the live streaming of federal parliament question time. Your thesis, I think, is that there is a democratisation in giving people direct access to events rather than it being mediated through a media gatekeeper. So why don't we kick off around there and expand on that thinking a bit, and then we can kick that idea around a bit.
In using the example of Justice Lee's decision to live stream the Lehman Channel 10 case, I'm also aware that there's nothing particularly new in that, and in fact, one of the early arguments, if we go back to the early days of blogging that we were talking about in the first instance, was that one of the things that sort of platform brought to the table, or what the digitization of information brought to the table, was that it was a way of working around the mediation of information. Which was normally how we received it, especially in terms of political information. So how we engage with politics is even now, but back then, in the early 2000s, it's almost completely mediated. Part of the role of journalists was they have social license to speak to politicians and other experts within the political class in particular. They have a unique access to information that wasn't available to consumers of news, and you know, their role was very much to play that role exactly. But once information started to be digitised, that notion fell away. So that, you know, you could watch a press conference on TV, you could go to the minister's website and find a transcript of their comments on a range of media organisations, or at events where they'd given speeches or outlined policy or whatever. You could look at, it was much easier now to look at legislation itself and exposure drafts and that kind of stuff, which had been hidden from, you know, just wasn't available to the general public in any sort of meaningful way before. So what Justice Lee did the other day was a continuation of that. And I just thought it was a very striking example of the upside of that sort of exposing the general public to the primary information. Because I found that sitting there watching most of that trial was such an educative process about, for someone like me who not trained in law and has had very little experience inside a courtroom, to watch that process unfold. And I don't know if it was a particular instance with this court case that they seem to me very open about discussing all the aspects of the case with each other, the barristers involved with the judge. And there was often, you know, this very open discussion, it seemed to me, about, you know, what they were trying to achieve and what the point of law was, as well as I got a much better idea of the cross-examination process and the sort of the way in which the witnesses responded to the questions, and really how difficult it was to get them to be responsive in the legal sense, which was a concept that I didn't really understand, I don't think, at all until I watched the case. And then once the case was over, to have the judgment, to see Justice Lee sit there and give the edited version of his 324-page ruling, and then be able to sit down and read the ruling, is an incredibly valuable thing, I think, for citizens in general. And given the nature of the way in which the media had covered this particular case, where it was very easy for them and us to be distracted by all sorts of extravagant side paths around this incredibly telling case. It was great to have been part of that process and to be able to read that ruling, and not just to have to rely on the mediated version of it, which is not to say that some of the coverage wasn't good, or that we certainly need those sorts of summaries, etc., etc. But
well, the other interesting thing was the media was the defendant. It wasn't a criminal case. It had all the trappings of a criminal case, but it was actually a civil case against Channel 10.
Yeah, I think that was interesting too. And one of the I thought interesting things about it was the different set of presumptions that journalists and, in this case, solicitors or other people brought to what was reasonable and acceptable in these circumstances. One of the key issues that occupied a fair bit of time was whether Channel 10 had given Bruce Lehrmann enough time to respond to the case before it went to air. And I think they'd given him, was it 3 days, like it was Friday to Monday or something like that.
I think it was even less than that.
They let him know on Friday that the story was going to go ahead, and it happened on Monday, or maybe they told him on Saturday and the show was on Tuesday, something like that. And there was all of the journalists and producers said that's an enormous amount of time. Warning
Oh yeah, if you got a really good story, you bring them 5 minutes before deadline. That was
yeah. So they thought they were being, they were really covering their bases in that respect. Whereas, I think a lot of people saw that, and certainly it was put to them by opposing counsel that actually that's you're talking about a young man who theoretically doesn't have access to the money for legal advice, etc. You're giving him a weekend essentially to get his act together. That doesn't seem very reasonable at all. So those sorts of issues around exposing those sorts of issues which are kind of commonplace for people within the media. I don't think they're commonplace for consumers of media. And so I think there was real value and it was an educative process to have that trial live streamed in the way that it was.
I just offer a couple of different thoughts, maybe complementary or also kind of counterposed in some ways to what you're saying. Like it is true that open justice has been a focus of multiple different court systems for a while now. So there's at any one time, federal court proceedings, state court proceedings are often live streamed, and quite sophisticated technology where you'll be able to see the documents that are being referred to. You'll be able to know who's cross-examining and the basis. I think there's been a real embrace by courts of these kinds of processes, and I think there's a value in it, and it's been going on for a while. As a class actions litigator, I see huge utility in doing that when you're representing 8, 10, 50, 100,000 people, the capacity for them to come on and see what's going on without having to attend in person. There's obviously a huge amount of utility in that. And it was, sort of in the bushfires class action here in Victoria where that kind of began of sorts, this process of open justice for people who are affected by this litigation. I feel a little concerned about the fact that at the end of the day, this is a kind of a perfect media case. Like part of my objection to this whole issue is that the media has been minorly obsessed with it and doesn't seem at all doesn't seem hugely concerned about the real world consequences for people who are central to the story. And at the heart of this is still about a rape of a young woman in a workplace, pretty horrendous circumstances. And here's another example of her experience being then broadcast and picked over, and the media, I think, considers itself, or sections of the media consider itself vindicated. So this was largely a good thing, and I think it's worth pausing and wondering about that. Just because I think you're right, Tim, to point out that the mainstream media is, there's a lot of failings that are on display in the course of this case by various media actors, and that's bringing that to light is useful. But I think at the end of the day, most people sort of perceive this as a victory for the media against a plaintiff in a defamation case. And I hope that's not the entirety of the message that is taken home from this experience. And there's really big questions for me about how this whole issue was unfolded. The criminal investigation, all sorts of stuff from various journalists being involved. And that I think it does leave a bit wanting about the Australian media that, that should be a pretty strong emphasis coming out of this. And I'm a bit frightened that it might not be.
No, I think it does sort of put them on notice about this sort of stuff. And I think it really did highlight the incredible abuse of power that happened in regard to Brittany Higgins herself. And I should just point out that the article I wrote really framed it around that we couldn't lose sight of that fact. The trauma that she was forced to relive through this case. But I actually think it opened up that discussion in a way that probably wouldn't happen if it had just been behind closed doors and those issues hadn't been aired in the way that they were, and you could see, you could see the trauma involved in a process like this. Far be it from me to say that, to offer her up as some sort of martyr to this cause. I'm not trying to do that at all. But given that it was televised in the way that it was, I think it actually did open up those questions and make a lot of people realise the absolute shortcomings, not just with media coverage, but with the law itself. And I think that's a really good thing.
But let's go a bit deeper. So what is the cause here? So is your proposition that if we can access the information ourselves and make sense of it ourselves, we no longer need the gatekeeper? Or is it that the reason it's illuminating is because the gatekeeper has failed us? And by the gatekeeper, I'm talking about the media. Just draw that out a little bit more, Tim.
I'm not making a case to get rid of the media by any stretch of the imagination. If anything, I think it's potential. This sort of availability of information is potentially a tool that makes the media do their job better, because there is a sort of a check and balance against their interpretation that can be brought into play in a way that never used to be possible. But there's 100% a role for media to report these cases and to report politics and stuff in general. I'm not saying get rid of the media by any stretch of the imagination. I just think it's useful for a democracy to have access to the primary material on which the media used to have exclusive control or exclusive access. That's a better outcome for a democracy than to keep it behind those walls.
So I was about to make a similar point, Tim. So forgive me if this is a little bit repetitive, but I think it bears just focusing on for a second. So I think if you compare the coverage of the Brittany Higgins rape, I think we can safely call it now, compared with the coverage of this hearing and this outcome, the media coverage in general that followed it, the final judgment, was of a higher quality than we saw during the case itself, and certainly during the months and years that led up to it. And I think, to your point, probably a reason for that is that the media knew that there were 46,000 something or whatever people that were watching the live stream, keeping them honest to make their reporting as truthful as it possibly could be. Now, I would just hasten to add, though, we're talking about the media here as one big uniform block. That is not the case. And some media outlets use this circumstance and for their own political ends or their own ends, and some reported on it much more responsibly. Dare I say it, at the risk of sounding incredibly defensive, I think The Guardian did a much better job of covering it than any other media, mainstream or legacy media organisation. But I think that's an important point, because I think sometimes, the media gets blamed for shoddy practices, as was exposed in 10 giving Lehrman insufficient time to respond to their questions, as if that is the standard practice of all media. Now, to be clear, I've been working in mainstream media for 25 years, and that does happen all too common or all too often. So I'm not downplaying it, but it is not always the case that happens. And I think that the other thing that often happens with people from the sidelines is they'll pick up these injustices or these mistakes that the media make, and then apply that to the so-called legacy media or the mainstream media, as if all of the mainstream media do this, which is just bullshit. It's just not. It's not the case. That some media organisations are better than others. Some journalists within media organisations are better than others. And so I think you've always got to be careful here, I think, when we're talking about the media, to remember that journalists themselves operate at different standards, as do mastheads themselves and editors themselves, and they're not the same thing. But on the whole, I think I agree with you. I think more transparency, more giving the public access to the underlying material is important, not because there's going to be a huge amount of people who are going to take the time to actually do it and watch it themselves, but because it's going to make keep the media honest in their reporting. I think it's that more of that is for the good.
And I've got to say, that's actually literally a point I make in the article, that the quality of the coverage after the judgment improved greatly. And I think it's for exactly the reasons that you're pointing out. And certainly I agree that, yeah, just for shorthand reasons, we're kind of sometimes forced to talk in terms of the media, and clearly they're not all the same. And I think in the ongoing criticism I do of that space, I'm generally pretty careful to make that point. You can't always do it in a shorthand way. But I would also say that there is enough evidence over, say, the more than 20 years that I've been looking closely at this stuff, that it's the standard's pretty low on the whole, which is not a popular thing to say, I know, but that there is. I'm not trying to justify saying that all media are the same. They're not at all. But the failures are pretty consistent. And what's, I think, even worse is that there is a reluctance amongst most mainstream journalists. And I know a lot of them. I've spoken to a lot of them. I've had these arguments with these discussions with a lot of them over a long period of time. There is a real reluctance to engage with the notion that some of the basic stuff about how journalism is done needs to change, is what I would say.
What's a better circumstance though, Tim? So you've gone and become quite a successful, Substacker in your own right, and there's a huge amount of other people out there that are publishing themselves. I guess I acknowledge your point, Tim, that the mainstream media, the legacy media, whatever you want to call it, in general, lacks self-reflection, lacks an ability to own up to where it gets things wrong. But I think that there is one also generalism that you can make about the legacy media, which is broadly true, and that is that there is at least a commitment to trying to get to the truth, which I don't think exists with so many of the independent publishers and the Substackers and whatever else who just don't have that basic commitment to journalism.
Really? Do you still stand by that in a world where Australian media is dominated by one particular company? Like, would you still? I know that's like we all drink the journalism Kool-Aid and say that's what it, but it's basically there's a whole bunch of perverse incentives that go underneath what appears to be the search for the truth, including selling. Well, now it's clicks. It's journalists getting their way up the greasy pole. Like Tim and I have both been on Murdoch's payroll, so we're not coming at this with clean hands either.
Exactly.
But, I don't know, Lizzie, you're the only disinterested outsider here. Do we end up drinking our own bathwater here when we talk about journalism?
I do find all this slightly mysterious as a professional from another field, because the coverage by the Australian has just been so bad that throughout this whole episode, but even post the decision, that the idea that I sort of remain a bit perplexed by why there's no kind of interest in kind of doing something about that from within the profession itself. Like, maybe it's because everybody ends up working there at some point. Is that part of it? I don't know. But like, there's been scandals in the legal profession. It happens all the time, but we have an ethical regime. Like, people do fall foul of it. There's a decision-making process. It's your livelihood. It's a slightly different setup. I'll give you that.
You can't regulate the media because that would have a chilling effect on free speech.
I'm not proposing that.
I'm joking. That's just the argument. That
but I'm not even proposing
beyond regulation. Yeah.
Well, we're self-regulated. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's a I mean, we've got regulation that's imposed on us in terms of our ethical obligations, but there's no kind of government body that comes and tells lawyers that they've done the wrong thing. Like, I mean, I'm fully aware that there's plenty of criticisms to be made of my profession, don't get me wrong. But I do, when I'm comparing the two, I just sort of wonder how, well, firstly, how Dan can have a straight face when he says that it's about the pursuit of truth looking at the Australians' coverage. But also more generally,
you've just proved my point, Lizzie. You've just so yes, the Australian, particularly in this circumstance, I think their coverage has been appalling and lacking. But I would not say. I would say that on the whole, the media is and perhaps not with this issue, but on the whole, most journalists are trying to get to the truth. I've worked at everything from community radio, where I started, through the West Australian, through Yahoo News, through 7 News, through The Guardian, through the Sunday Times. I've worked at, I've had a lot to do with News Corp over the years. There are certainly a sizable number of journalists who have an axe to grind and bugger the truth. That is not most journalists. That is not my experience with them. That is not my experience with them at all.
I get that, but what do you do about that? Because it's sort of like the opposite of a rising tide lifting all boats. It's a problem when bad behaviour is not managed. I'm not trying to cast aspersions on everybody, because I completely accept that. It's one of the reasons why, you know, in tech policy, we've sought consistently to protect freedom of the press and protect public interest journalism, because it's often a source of interest to authorities to surveil, to penalise whistleblowers. That's well established. And I sort of see the consistency there. But there is a problem when there's a publication that's very influential with key decision makers that is going around doing appalling stuff. I think it unfairly ends up tarnishing the mainstream media as an institution in a way that it makes it more difficult to have meaningful media criticism, because you've got to constantly kind of do the contextual explaining, which we're doing now. You know, I'm with you on that, on your point, Dan, but I don't think it solves the problem.
This is sprawling into quite a self-indulgent discussion. And I wonder how we land
Peter, that might be my
broader piece. No, I think it's mine as well. Don't worry. And Tim, sorry for taking your airtime on this as well. But how do we land this into the broader discussion? So our mission is to think through how we can sort of build better models of discourse, and sometimes that's been supporting things like the News Media Bargaining Code to get money into journalism. Sometimes it's supporting privacy reform. Sometimes it's calling out the abuse of tech power. So where do you feel this thinking lands in terms of that broader framework, Tim? And then maybe we can go around the lap one more time.
The way I look at it is, and it goes to Lizzie's point about the lack of reflectiveness within the profession of journalism itself. And I don't say that lightly. I say that based on experience within News Limited itself, as well as endless interviews and discussions with journalists who just don't acknowledge the problem. So just to cut all that short, the sort of direction I would like things to go is similar to the sort of direction I would like to see politics go as well, which is that it becomes a much more bottom up. The audience is bought into the process in a much more meaningful way than they are, that they aren't just the passive recipients of news in the way that journalism has traditionally delivered itself to an audience. That I would like to see audience bought into the process, or at least the process itself be made much more transparent than what it is, so that I mean, again, this is one of the things with the Lerman trial is that some of the, what are apparently normal processes of getting a story are exposed to the sunlight as
Coke and Thai massages, yeah.
Yeah, well, apparently. And so, that sort of transparency that comes from treating the audience as a partner in the news creating process is the sort of direction that I would like to head in the way. And one practical way to sort of think about this is in the way that some newspapers have readers, editors, somebody who acts on behalf of the readers, is a liaison, takes the reader's point of view to the journalists and to the editors, and argues the case that actual readers were brought into that process, maybe some sort of ongoing panel associated with each group, so that, the undeniable thing is that whatever allowances we make for, yes, there are good journalists and bad journalists, and we have to be careful about how we talk about this and not overgeneralize. One general fact that we can make is that people are turning away from being involved with news. There's a whole, especially younger people are completely turned off by what we would call, conventional news coverage of most topics. And you would think just from that point of view that the mainstream media would be more willing to look at the product that they're producing and the way they're producing it, and think about maybe there's a better way that we can do this.
So Dan, a bit like the old days they used to when you're on holidays, or at least when I was on holidays, Dad used to take us to the abattoir to see what happened to the cows. Like, you actually got to go and look at it. And my sister became a vegetarian, whereas I just liked meat even more. But maybe.
That wasn't, fortunately, my family's holidays. But it's good to see you comparing journalism to an abattoir, Peter. I would make two quick points if I could, and then I'll hopefully it won't be too self-indulgent. So Tim, I think I share your hope, if you like, for actually utilising technology to be able to have more of a conversation with your audience rather than just the broadcast model. And Peter's done a lot more thinking on this than I have. But I think that if that could happen more, I think we would result in greater engagement with the media. But I also think if there was just a general principle of journalists linking out to the source thing that they are reporting on, just as we have seen in this Lerman trial, then I think the quality of reporting would go up. If that was to become a norm, where in every article you see the source material was made available, which happens sometimes, but certainly not often enough, I think the quality of it would rise. I would just make one last point, though, if I could, which is, as usual, a negative point to end on. So yes, Tim, younger people are not very engaged with the media. That's not unusual, by the way. I think there's enough evidence to suggest that people sort of start to engage with the world around them, in their late 20s, early 30s, often when they're starting families and whatever else. The worry I have now, though, is that yeah, maybe they're young people. Anyway, but my point is that the problem now is that for the generations coming through now and who have been coming through for some time, just as they're starting to get engaged, their primary method for engaging with the media is via large tech platforms. And the large tech platforms are often promoting content which drives engagement, as we talked about many times, over quality journalism, because it's more exciting. And often that content is from individual bloggers that don't have a commitment to journalistic principles and how they go about things. And so as a result of that, we're ending up in a world of increasing mis and disinformation, and that's how people are getting their news sources. And I think that's what's fundamentally eroding sort of trust in democracy. And on that light note, Lizzie, fire at will.
Oh, well, I just think the mainstream media's got to focus on not contributing to mis and disinfo as well. Like, it's not that, I mean, there are instances of mistake for sure, but there's also a whole business model now for mainstream media in producing content that goes viral, including on platforms like YouTube, where Sky News, for example, is extremely successful. So reorienting the business imperatives is pretty critical, I think, to getting a functioning media as well. But yeah, I largely agree with the point. I think that the journalists of the future that are going to be the most successful will not be as affronted as some journalists have been in recent times at having engagements with their audience, and will actually embrace that as a tool for better, higher quality journalism. And I think that will make the best of the technology that we find ourselves with at this point in time, and hopefully act as a counterweight to the overwhelming kind of experience of social media and, low quality content, which I agree should not be the primary way in which people engage with the world.
On that vaguely optimistic note, we might call stumps. The only thing to add is that we are running next Tuesday, if you're listening to this in the next 7 days, a live event called Open Dialogue with my friends in the disability sector, the first ever all disability live webinar / town hall, where we're going to be launching a massive citizen science project to map where the gaps in disability services are around the country. So that's going to be really exciting. And it actually merges a few of those ideas we've been talking about today. Rather than doing a story on it, we're going to go and do the research. That's going to be great fun. Anything coming up with Digital Rights Watch, Lizzie, that we need to know about, apart from the great work that you're always doing and the privacy laws that still seem to be somewhere on the horizon and
Picking along,
they're
coming this year, I'm hearing, and that will hopefully address some of the problems that we've talked about tonight.
Indeed. All right, guys. Thanks for making the time, Tim. Great discussion.
Pleasure.
Look,
thank you.
And we'll put a link to your Substack in the show notes as well. Thanks for being part of it, and thanks for being available to talk through some of our mad ideas from time to time as well. Dan, good travels back to Perth, and we'll see you again in a fortnight, everyone. Thanks for being part of it.
Thanks, folks.
That was Burning Platforms, brought to you by Capita's Centre of the Public Square. It was recorded on April 23 and produced on Naarm land by Rebecca Connell. Talk again soon.